Hello, and welcome back to Palatinate podcast. This is Domestic Politics and News. I'm Joshua Vickers, and today we're bringing you a very special episode focusing on ADHD at university. Today I'm joined by three amazing guests. I'll let them introduce themselves.
I'm Ben Green. I'm a third-year history student at Collingwood, and I'm the editor-in-chief at the Durham Tab.
Hi, I'm Tara Hardy. I'm a second year, but I've been at Durham for 3 years. So I'm also co-pres of Mary's Dance. I'm at Mary's and I'm a law student.
I'm Zanzi Gunton. I'm in my third year of sociology, but this is my fourth year at Durham. I'm from St. Aidan's, and I'm captain of softball.
I didn't know that.
That's quite cool. Let's start off with Ben. You're editor-in-chief at the Tab. What's that like for you? With somebody with ADHD, they can find it often quite difficult to have their own life in order, never mind an entire newspaper.
Yeah, I think it kind of varies week to week. So some weeks I'm very on it. I mean, recently had a brief break, but normally it's quite fun because it's quite stimulating and it's something I just really enjoy and love, and it kind of gets you up for the day, gives you a bit of purpose. Sometimes it's quite good because it gives me that structure to do my uni work alongside it. But then sometimes if I hyper-focus really hard, then it can be a bit draining. To some extent, I think it's a way to procrastinate doing uni work by doing other productive work sometimes, but it's maybe not entirely a bad thing.
Yeah, I find that with the stuff I do for Palatinate as well. Like, I'll find myself making adverts when I should be reading something on Marx. That's one thing I've noticed since I've started medication. I still procrastinate. That's not something that's gone away. It's just changed form. Instead of lying in bed all day playing video games, I'll write something. Nothing to do with my degree at all, but it is productive in a way. That's my excuse.
Well, it's interesting because I think for me, medication has made me more aware and in control of what I'm doing, in that when I am procrastinating, and for me, it's usually not necessarily something so productive. It will usually be a random thought that's crossed my mind that I suddenly am Googling random things, or I'm like, oh, what if I needed a sofa bed in my room? And then I'm suddenly doing that, and I'll never buy the sofa bed. But I'll actually sometimes have a thought and I'll be like, okay, Tara, is this a productive thing to be doing in this very moment? You literally have a tutorial tomorrow and you haven't prepared for it. And I'll have to be like, okay, I need to stop. And so that's been really helpful for me. Because before, it's hard to feel like you don't really have control of what you're doing. But I would say medication is helpful because I do feel like I have autonomy. So that's quite nice.
Do you think it's also dependent on the physical location you're in? So for me personally, I have to be in a quiet setting like a library. And then obviously I now have the energy and my concentration has greatly improved since starting medication. But for me, if I'm in my bedroom, then I'm just going to end up going down a rabbit hole. I'll tidy my bedroom. I will tidy the entire flat. But I won't do my uni work unless I'm actually in a setting where my brain associates that with, doing it. Is that something you found as well?
I'm quite bad for doing basically all of my work from my bed. I do think that it definitely does help to be in a setting where I don't have the option to just do something else, or just be like, oh, let's just slide my windows over and I'm gonna watch something on Netflix or something like that. I think for me, I find it really difficult to actually have the energy or mental strength to leave my house and go somewhere. So it's more so for me, how do I tie being in the library or being somewhere with a different event that I do feel like I have to go to. So oftentimes I'm going to this lecture, and after this lecture, I'm going to force myself to just go to the library because I don't really have an excuse not to, because it's right next to it. But I would say going into places where I actually could be a lot more productive is a skill that I just have not mastered. So I do think I just struggle through being in my room. I'm also quite bad for not even working at my desk. I truly do work from my bed, but we're making it work.
You're getting it done. That's the main point. It's not really about what setting you need to be productive, as long as you're doing the necessary steps to be able to be productive for yourself.
Let's talk a little bit about you, Zanzi.
I work for an after-school program. It's a CIC charity, and I've been at this job for nearly 2 years. I love working with kids. I'm really passionate about childhood development. I think it's one of the most influential parts of people's lives that is not taken seriously enough. And in my point of view, the kind of growth of neurodivergence in discussion is just the beginning of us finally identifying different types of processing. There's this big movement to call it problems, there's something wrong with you, all that kind of thing in terms of like stigma. But I genuinely think like we're just at the beginning of unraveling how many types of different ways of thinking there are, how many different types of structuring and organization there are. And yeah, working with these kids has been genuinely life-changing. It's been my grounding factor during university above any of my other activities because I learned so much about myself in that setting. I started the job way before I was diagnosed, and it was actually working with primarily autistic kids, but we have all types of neurodivergence, especially autism and ADHD when it overlaps, and just seeing how the symptoms were in their most kind of open state, in their most raw state, because obviously as we get older, we learn to mask and we learn to adjust and we learn what's socially acceptable in terms of symptoms versus these kids are young. They're like 6 to 12. And so they're just acting how they feel and seeing that kind of balance and looking at myself. It was like, oh, like, what have I been making myself feel embarrassed for that I don't need to in terms of like when I get anxious or excited, my hands shake or I twitch a little bit more and bounce up and down, little things like that.
Literally, we just act like cartoon characters. The Tasmanian devil. Yeah. So you were saying that it's made you discover more about yourself. Were you aware that you were ADHD before going into that experience?
I've been in and out of school testing for a while. When I was in high school, it was kind of this, oh, why aren't you doing as well as you should be doing in terms of exams and homework? You should be smart enough to be getting better grades. And I was like, well, sorry, like, what am I supposed to do about that? And I went in and out of testing, but I don't know, bad school system did not go super well. I was labeled as, emotionally troubled instead because I achieved high enough to not be an academic problem. So then they deemed it had to be emotional. And so then from that, I was like, okay, well, if it's not a standard learning difference, what is wrong with me? And it actually set me on quite a, not necessarily destructive path, but I didn't know what resources to look for. And then it was actually during my degree when I switched to sociology and doing classes in medicine and learning about our legislation on disability and how it's most recently expanding to include mental health and learning differences. Only then I was like, wow, I really kind of fit these symptoms and I feel this kind of profile of difference could really help me. So even though I wasn't diagnosed, I just started looking at help for ADHD in terms of structure. I'm so bad at organizing my work. I'm all over the place. Talk about procrastination. I will literally do anything but stay at home, whether it's softball or I play college football or my job. I am also a hobbyist photographer. It's just anything I can do to be out of my house.
We're complete opposites in that way. I'm like, we'll just lay in my bed and do nothing. Or not nothing, but I think I get so overwhelmed by everything that I can't do anything at all.
If I'm wanting to have a productive day, it needs to be productive from the get-go, or I've set myself up to fail. So it's a little bit like what you were saying when you said that you have to organize plans based off proximity. Just for context, we did we were meant to be doing a little photo video shoot before this, me and Tara. Didn't end up happening, but that was going to be right next to where we're now recording this. So it's stuff like that. But if I didn't have that plan in place, I would have had, 4 hours in the morning of doing absolutely nothing. I probably would have turned up late.
No, that's the thing. And we were texting before this and I was like, oh, do you want to do this photo shoot thing before or after the session? Because otherwise, realistically, I don't know if it's ever going to happen. It almost needs to be tied to an event that we've agreed with other people to go to. Because if it's just me and you, one of us is going to have to really force us to be like, okay, we need to make plans for it. And then you were like, oh, well, we should do it before. And then I put, oh, that's good because it is good for me to actually have things in the morning because it forces me to start my day.
if I don't have anything in my day until, let's say, about 2 p.m., 3 p.m., like if it's 8 p.m., 9 p.m., fine, like I can try and do something in the day. But if it's kind of, especially early afternoon, it's a case of I think, right, I've got this, then I can't be late, I need to be there. But also, like, your mind's just occupied with it. Even though you're not actually doing something, you're quite overwhelmed by the prospect. So therefore, it can be quite hard to do stuff in the morning because you're like, well, if it takes me this long to do this, then I'm not going to get anything done. And I think I've got a real problem with perfectionism where I can't just do 60% of a job and then come back to do the 40% afterwards. I just won't do the rest of it realistically. I won't do it for weeks. But then on the flip side, early mornings, 9 a.m. when you're not getting much sleep, especially because having ADHD, obviously your brain's quite active. It can be quite hard for me to switch my brain off. I tried sleeping pills in the past. They kind of worked, but it got to a point, found it incredibly difficult to the point of impossible to sleep without them. So came off them addiction-wise.
And sometimes they make it so difficult to even wake up, and then that's a whole other trying to motivate your day.
I feel so lucky with not having sleep issues. I am someone who gets a lot of energy during the evening or nighttime, but it's just meant more so that I go to sleep late and I wake up late. But I don't have issues going to sleep, and I feel really lucky. Also, having ADHD, your brain is constantly so busy. But then normally, if you are medicated, you're on a stimulant medication. And so that makes sleeping even worse for a lot of people.
It's a weird one, to be honest, because before I started medication, I'd say that I was the exact same. I could only ever do work in the evening. But now I'm so tired in the evening from when I have my crash from the medication. But the mornings I'm really productive. I can think better. I've been making a documentary at the moment, which is like consisted of me timetabling people I'm going to interview. That's really gotten me out of the house because there's that stress of somebody waiting there and you're not there. And it's that I have like 7 people in one day. So I have that 7 times a day. It's really helping me structure my life. When you think about the misconceptions of ADHD, it's typically that really loud, energetic boy in primary school, usually a boy, and he's naughty, doesn't get work done. So that being the conception, it's harmful because a lot of people don't realise that they're struggling until they're in a setting where there's no structure. So for me, it didn't even cross my mind that I'd have ADHD because I did well in school. But when I came to uni, everything like turned upside down. I was doing things that I used to love, but was doing them in such an unstructured way, especially during COVID when I never left my room because it was lockdown. Just my academic and my mental health as a result, I really struggled with it. And that's when family members started to mention to me, maybe you should have a look into this. But in my head, I still associated it with hyperactivity. I'd say that one thing to mention about ADHD pills, like Concert or whatever you're on, it just brings you up to a level that, neurotypical people are on. Energy levels, concentration, it does bring you up, but it doesn't solve organizational skills. It doesn't solve issues of actually being productive in a day. You have to do that yourself. You have to learn those skills. And that's what I'm learning right now. I spent the first 2-3 years of uni just winging it. But now I feel like I can actually focus academically. I'm in my final year, but I'm only now figuring out how to make notes, how to write an essay. Just like that self-discipline is something I'm learning now, and I'm able to do so because of medication.
But what I find really interesting is that I found working 9 to 5 over summer, when you're in that kind of 40-hour-a-week work routine, actually in the morning your brain's fine because you're forcing yourself to get up at 6:30, 7 every day because you literally don't have a choice. There's literally no option. Whereas at uni, for example, I could wake up at 8:30 because I'm like, right, I'm going to get to the library for 9:30, have a really productive day. I could wake up at 8:30 and not have left my house by 11 because either I fall back to sleep or it takes me ages to get out of bed. I'm procrastinating because I know I don't actually have to. I know there's no consequences. And for my brain, if there's no consequences or I don't really want to do something, I can't just discipline myself to do that. And that's a skill I really need to learn.
I spent years in my bed doing nothing. I could never find the motivation. I like to be quite active, but I couldn't even find the motivation to do that.
Yeah.
So I found if I made myself join sports teams, I'm quite socially anxious, but I really threw myself into photography, just signed myself up to things that it got me out of the house. And then it also made me have to interact with people to the point of you could let someone down.
Yeah.
And so then that holds me accountable to get the work done, which normally I wouldn't, because my personal photography, haven't touched it in years.
Yeah, I think what's annoying or what's frustrating is the idea that I know that the motivation I'll get to do work requires that anxiety from leaving it late. I am envious of almost like neurotypical people who can just self-motivate themselves, like can just think, okay, I'm just going to do this piece of work in small increments over a longer period of time, rather than having some sort of rush of hyper-focusing on work the night before, because that's the only time that you actually had motivation to do it, because you had to do it at that very time. There's no other option, because it is really stressful. But hyper focusing on something is quite fun, because then when you're actually doing that work and you're really into it, and if I'm writing an essay, for example, and I'm really getting into it, that can be extremely rewarding and very stimulating. But it's the stress surrounding that, and I guess negative perceptions of the fact that that's really irresponsible. Well, at least I'm always like, oh, I should really be doing more research, but I just don't have the time. And so that can be a bit negative, or it can make you feel quite stressed. But I do think it is important to sort of recognize that joys and hyperfocus.
I can't remember the last time I made notes in a lecture or seminar, and that's incredibly unproductive. I think I used to hate myself for that, but I realize sometimes that in order to hyperfocus when you need to, sometimes you actually do need to save your brain energy a little bit. Because we do have an ability when you've got a week left to do something where you can do way more in a few days than the average person when you're hyper-focused, when you really need to and when you really want to. And actually sometimes trying to follow such a neurotypical pattern means that when it comes to that, you've actually burnt yourself out sometimes.
Yeah, I'd definitely say that people with ADHD, we do work better under pressure. So, it might sound slightly dodgy leaving things to last minute, but as long as you plan around that, you give yourself enough time to get something done, even if it is last minute, that isn't necessarily a bad thing.
For me, at least, I would definitely say that last minute kind of rush is actually quite enjoyable. Yeah. Is that like, if I was to do something in small increments, I wouldn't enjoy it. Like, there's no way. But doing it at the end, like, it is actually quite fun. Like, and people don't understand that. They're like, how are you in the library for like 48 hours? In that situation, I don't always enjoy it, don't get me wrong, but like, there have been genuine times where I've had a great time doing it. And I wonder if it is a case that I think I probably have a bit of a problem with authority, and I wouldn't be surprised if that's a general trait of people with ADHD.
We all talk about how we don't like things being imposed on us, but they can be helpful and they help us have structure in our lives.
People with ADHD really struggle to create routine, but hate having routine imposed on them, or sort of structure. And I definitely had that too. I think for a lot of secondary school, I was in a boarding school. And so it was a situation in which actually the structure was quite helpful. I didn't have much free time and everything was very structured, and it kind of felt like you were constantly at school. But because of that, it made me super not actually necessarily depressed. I mean, I thought I was, but now I'm like, that's just sort of an ADHD symptom of sort of low energy and constantly overstimulated and constantly overwhelmed. And I hated having authority. I've never been good with having rules that I disagree with. I just wouldn't follow them because you can sort of get away with it. But I think that was a major impact on my life, because for a lot of secondary school, I had so much sort of authority and there were so many things that I wasn't allowed to do. I didn't have control over my life. And that was such an important thing for me that it really impacted my mood. It made me really overwhelmed all the time.
I think it's that stress that's what meds have helped me the most to deal with. However, I do kind of want to throw in, meds definitely aren't a cure-all for everyone. It affects everyone so differently with different types of conditions. Some people can't take physical pills for whatever reason. And the main thing I feel I've identified in myself with meds, that I'm having all the same reactions. None of my symptoms have changed in terms of the base level for ADHD. The only thing that's a little bit less is my emotional reaction instead of when I am scattered and feeling overwhelmed, getting to the point of panic, I'm aware of that kind of increase in energy in my body, because I really mainly went on meds just for this last year to really try and tap into this quote-unquote neurotypical mindset so I could do well my last year of uni. But I'm really hoping to just stop after, because I work really well hands-on. Aside from academia, I have never had a problem communicating or doing the things I've needed to do in my day, aside from when I'm in education institutions.
Out of interest, were you on ADHD medication and antidepressants at the same time?
A lot of SSRIs, so like the sertraline I'm on, I've noticed that typically would make me feel a little bit like a zombie. I'd feel a little bit detached. And then the ADHD pills are meant to heighten awareness. So I just feel like my ADHD pills aren't working as well as they should. When I came back to Durham this year, and I only started medication, I was diagnosed in March last year. I started getting medication in August. So I was going through the process of seeing what the right dosage for me was. I'd say my first week walking around Durham, suddenly became conscious of how I was moving my arms when I was walking. I just became very self-conscious. But then I've gotten used to it now, but that was like part of the process of, my body getting used to it.
I was doing that for probably about a year and a half, I'd say, from at the start of year 13 through to about halfway through first year. And it was kind of like it almost counterbalanced each other to the point where I didn't actually feel like either of them really had an impact. It kind of felt like they numb me in, because they kind of do the opposite thing, right? Like that's kind of the idea. I was 17 when I got diagnosed as well, so probably was a case of, I think, went into year 13, just kind of thought just gotta lock in for a year and just get on with it. But I think I'm probably at a point now where I should maybe look at my medication, how I want to change that, because the heightening awareness is a very good point, and that can be good sometimes, but equally you do feel so detached from reality. It's a really hard emotion to describe, really, where you feel just very static, especially if you're in a big social environment. Like I'm quite an extroverted person. I like being around people. I'm chatty. But when you're in like the library cafe, let's say like that, on medication, you're having like a bit of a average day anyway. You feel so static and so overly aware of your surroundings that you feel incredibly awkward. And actually having that, to some extent, sometimes ignorance is bliss, right?
If I had it my way, I wouldn't be on any anxiety medication, because I don't think I have anxiety disorder. I think I've just got ADHD. I definitely think that medication is the right route for me in terms of ADHD meds. If there isn't an alternative solution in the future, I expect to be on them for the rest of my life. And I don't have an issue with that, to be honest.
My therapist was basically saying, which was a bit of a hard hit, Tara is emotionally reactive. And I was like, what? And I basically was like, oh, so I'm sensitive. You're just calling me sensitive. As in, and I think it is true. And that's sort of like a nicer way of putting it. But I do think with having ADHD, that's the whole classic, undiagnosed ADHD in women. And that's typically inattentive ADHD, which, men definitely experience as well. But it's this sort of thing of having very extreme sort of emotional reactions to things. And that often presents itself as some kind of mental health disorder, when in reality, it's not necessarily that you're depressed or that you have anxiety, but in that moment, your reaction is equivalent to someone who maybe does have that, but it doesn't last. That's the main thing.
Would you not say it's both? Why the focus on separating rather than the overlap?
I think some people definitely do have both. I think from my own personal experience, I can separate them just because I the more that I actually look in myself and realize what's happening, I can have a sort of crash and then I will have a low mood for a long period of time. But I don't think it actually is sort of what depression is, in that it's throughout the day, I'll randomly have periods of being super energized and feeling happy, but I'll be 2 hours out of a day.
Well, I would say that's a issue with our current quite generalized labeling system. But that also goes for ADHD and autism. I will make that point. These terms are so big and the symptoms bleed all into each other. And I think a lot of our mental health labels and parameters are all about behavior. And so, I don't know, when discussing what the difference is, I think we should be more using kind of both terms because it's describing that stress we were talking about earlier. It's not necessarily just ADHD because someone undiagnosed could be experiencing something so similarly and call it anxiety. But since we're still at such a beginning of kind of studying this, I'm going to tell you right now, we're very behind on tests and social research, and like we do not know how many people are affected. It's a privilege to be diagnosed. Most people who are neurodivergent aren't diagnosed at all. Children in school are sometimes just labeled as difficult just because they won't sit still, and that sometimes this isn't even technically ADHD, it's forms of autism. You can get hyperactive types of autism.
I think that really is a valid point to make, how privileged we are, all of us being diagnosed. Because, yeah, as you said, many people will never be diagnosed in their life. And that may be down to NHS waiting lists, which is, somebody said to me the other day, it might have been one of you guys.
I think it was me. I am on like a private health, like I see a psychiatrist, but that is private just because when I called the NHS, because I was like, oh, I really would like to be switched. Because the other thing that is, another socioeconomic barrier to sort of diagnosis, but also just management, is that medication for ADHD is very expensive. It's there's like a sort of global shortage of a lot of medications, and it's meant that the price of those medications has significantly increased. And I'm really fortunate that my parents offered to pay for it, but not everyone gets the luxury, and it's £70 for like 30 pills or something. That's crazy. And it's like, and I'm not taking, you could choose to take Concerta. So that's basically Ritalin, but it's extended release. And that's the official sort of brand. I don't even take that because it's quite expensive. I take a non-branded version, which is slightly cheaper, but that's still £70.
I mean, if you're getting it through the NHS, you can either get it for free based off your income, or, well, the standard NHS fee for prescriptions is, I think it's around £10. £9.95.
But it was 4 years is what they said to me for the wait list. And that's just to get on the starting line.
I think as uni students, coming to understand what living with ADHD is like, also part of that is informing our job, our workplace, our unis on, what they can do best to help us get through it. Because like university in the UK at least is a paid experience. It's important that we get back as much as a neurotypical person would. So is there any advice you'd give to disability support at UK unis in general for what they could do?
I feel like in terms of accommodations, people don't realize how the simplest changes could make the biggest difference in someone's motivation. Like we talked about earlier, the biggest things we're learning, regardless of medication, is practicing organization and the importance of structure and how we need to find that motivation in ourselves to organize ourselves into a routine we're comfortable in. And how these are practices that are good for anyone, regardless of neurodivergence or not.
My favorite seminar leaders in Durham, they're typically the ones who, even if I've missed a deadline for a formative, like specifically a formative assessment, so assessment that won't count towards my final grade, it's just to help me learn the techniques and see if I'm going down the right road with it. The ones who, if I've missed a deadline, they are flexible, they're willing to mark it even if it's like a week or two late. I know that shouldn't be like enforced or anything, but people really appreciate it, especially because I get so stressed even if I don't do a formative, and I want to get the most from my education as possible. And it's not that I didn't want to do it. I might have struggled to do it and organize myself in, So yeah, I think that for society in general, for like the workplace and the education system, just being more flexible with deadlines, which is something I think Durham is quite good at once, you've got a diagnosis. Like, I know for me, with my dyslexia as well, they have been quite cooperative, I'd say.
I think for me, what I think would be useful is, I guess, obviously university, you're kind of trying to build self-study skills. And I do think that that is very important. But I do also think that having more contact hours, or not even necessarily contact hours, but I do think just having more points of call. I don't know how much I can talk about Durham specifically, but there is the concept of having sort of like an academic advisor who you maybe meet with once a term, maybe once a year. I wouldn't necessarily, and I don't know how much of a well-being role they need to have, but I do think it's useful to, you know, be forced to sort of admit that like maybe things aren't going so well. Because I think for me, it was quite easy to just get lost in the system where, you know, I don't hand in a summative or I don't hand in coursework. Maybe I'll get an email being like, you haven't submitted this, here are some people you can contact and stuff like that. But there's no real check on sort of like forcing you to kind of confront the fact that things aren't going so well. And I think that's really important because you're fresh out of school and just being expected to suddenly be able to manage your own routine and structure yourself and be able to do everything, I think is a bit of an unrealistic expectation. And I wasn't diagnosed when I entered uni. And so it's not as if I knew that these things were going to be an issue for me as well. So I think it's quite general. Like, I think that is just useful for most people.
It's an interesting one because as third and fourth years, our first introduction to, you know, like an academic supervisor is our dissertation supervisor. That's the first time I've ever had a structured deadline presented to me by a member of staff at the uni that's been outside of examinations. You need to have your plan done. You need to present a certain amount of information by this date in our session. And that really helps because it's got the whole, I don't want to say stress, but like you have the drive to do it to meet that deadline. And with dissertation supervisors, they are typically quite flexible with what you bring to the session, but they will tell you if you've not done enough. And I think that's helpful. It's a bit similar to like Oxford and Cambridge. That's one of their big selling points, how you have within college a academic supervisor who you meet with. I think it's either bi-weekly or I don't know how often you meet them.
I think Durham's quite lucky in that we have, because we have a college-based system, not only do we have department support, so I have been in contact with law support before, but we also have like college student support. And I do think that that is a great asset. But I think it becomes almost a bit difficult in that, like, I don't know, there are a few resources. They're not always necessarily that interlinked, and there's only really so much that they can do. It's like, oh great, you can talk to them, but if you're having emotional difficulties or mental health issues and then it needs to be, you know, that's affecting your academics. Having ADHD, I was like, I'm so proud of myself for even, you know, going and speaking to one person. That was a really big task that I was really afraid to do. In reality, I need to talk to 5 different people because there are so many hurdles I have to go through just to go through the system. And I'm sure it's the same in most universities, and that's just an administrative thing. But it makes it quite difficult to access support officially because it's like you have to almost prove that you need it.
I'd say there's only that departmental communication when you've hit rock bottom. So if you've got a academic progress notice, they do inform your college about that. So if you're not attending things, you'll get flagged. And then if you take it too far and, you know, you're in a situation where the department are having to get involved to discuss whether you'll actually continue at the university, your college is still involved in that. But I think with me, I went through all of that, to be honest. But my college was well aware of my situation because I went in once every 2 weeks to talk to them about how I wasn't attending. I think that's just a bit of advice I'd give to a student who's struggling with it. Get involved with your college, let them know like the extent and the details that you're struggling, even if you're not diagnosed. If you're struggling with your mental health, whether it be anxiety, going to seminars, all that jazz, just let them know, because having that on your record, which is private, it's just between you, the college and the university, it will massively help you. The more they know about you, the better.
If you're in a position where you need to reach out to them in the moment, that's probably because you've got stuff due quite imminently, or because stuff in your life is kind of exploding around you. So it often feels to me like, well, I might as well just get this over and done with, rather than wait a couple of weeks for all of this to come together. And it's often easier to just get that thing out of the way at first, which obviously in the long run is really unhealthy and not very productive. But the reality is when most people are going to reach out, it's at times when they're going to be struggling before they can actually access all those points of support. And kind of in terms of stuff that is difficult, I think students to some extent do have to take it upon themselves a bit, because you're right, Josh, that is the reality of the world. And while some companies are changing like that, you have to get better at that. And at the same time, the university has like 21,000 students. We can't possibly expect them to be proactive in every single case, every single time. That's not a realistic expectation. But at the same time, I think more could be done to some extent to reach out before people get to that point of rock bottom.
While a lot has not changed yet, there is that movement towards making things more fulfilling, that focus on taking care of yourself at the same time of being productive. You cannot be just a productive machine. You have to be able to balance.
We've come to the end of our discussion. Unfortunately, it's been so fun having you guys. Just to end with, is there anything you guys want to plug?
Walk On in June, charity fashion show. I'm head videographer. And come watch softball or come play. We're super fun.
Oh yeah, Mary's Dance is probably next term going to perform at some fashion shows. Also, if you want Mary's Dance to perform at your event, please let us know. We would be happy to do that. If you want to join Mary's Dance, you don't necessarily have to be in Mary's. It's super fun, super chill. We don't audition. You get to be with me.
If anyone needs a photographer or videographer, I got you.
If you would like to know more about the biggest football club in the UK, follow at the CCAFC on Instagram.
If you've enjoyed our conversation today, everyone here is in my documentary coming soon, Out the Box. What's it called actually? Beyond the Box, coming in December, which will cover neurodiversity at university as a whole. We hope you have a lovely weekend whenever this comes out to you, and thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.